So are you from Fond du Lac, Matt?
Yeah.
You are?
Essentially grew up in Fond du Lac, was not born here.
Okay.
But my dad was teaching and coaching in Colby, Wisconsin when I was born. So I was actually born in Marshfield. And then before I was even in kindergarten, he ended up getting one of the physical education jobs at the high school at Goodrich.
Oh, nice.
And assistant football coach, head track coach as well. And that's ran from there. So all my sisters went through Fond du Lac. We've stayed here the whole time.
So is that Fruth Field or what?
Yeah.
That's
Correct.
right. That's probably 15 blocks away from here.
Is it that far?
It might not be that far, but do they still play on that field?
Yep,
yeah, they do.
And that's the harangue right now is the fact that it's got that historic legacy because they've been playing there since the 20s essentially.
But it floods a lot.
They've got that issue now, and the fact that it's not on campus anymore.
Yeah.
Where it's just logistically it's a pain in the butt to move everything down there for the game and back.
Yep.
Springs has always played there as well. When I was in junior high, all the junior highs played there too.
Yep.
Savish and Tyson and good old Woodworth back when it was still open, then closed, then opened again. So it's got a lot of use. So there's a lot of old legacy to it. But the facility the field needs to be up at the high school.
Yeah, I mean that new high school is such a cool facility, and they've got a good amount of room, I believe, over there.
They do.
Yeah.
And some of it you got to watch out just because it's in that area where it gets a little marshy back in some of those areas back behind the school and stuff. So you got to always watch out what you can do back there, and I think they found that out.
Is it true that a lot of sports facilities are in floodplains? Is that a common? We have heard that. We're obviously in the lighting business. We deal with footings and concrete, and it seems like about nine times out of 10 when the contractor goes to dig the footing, they end up hitting water not too far below grade. But I mean, from your experience, is that a common problem?
You do see it a lot just because it's open, flat,
true,
for the most part.
And what else are they going to do with it?
Right. And so you're going to try to fit in as many fields, whether they're baseball, softball, bunch of rectangles for soccer and everything else, lacrosse and football. That's kind of where it goes. Obviously, a lot of what we're doing is at a high school, inside of a track, or at a college, maybe a track, maybe not. But the big complexes are the one that you see. Yeah. Those multi-field places that you see a lot of that. Now they're pushing out more into farm fields. Yeah. Like I was just down in the Kenosha this morning, and they've got all those different areas where it's just flat plowed fields, and then they've got this huge warehouse, Amazon or whatever is there. And those are prime. Nowadays, those are prime spots as well for sports complexes too. You're
saying by fulfillment centers or just
no, just that type of land.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
okay.
Just those types of areas where you're right next to a metro, yet it's still quasi-agricultural.
Easy in, easy out, right?
Yeah, flat. Yeah. Yeah, you're not dealing with, the hills and sometimes streams and creeks and all that kind of stuff.
So you started out in Marshfield. Family came to Fond du Lac, and you also did some coaching at some point as well, correct?
Right, yeah. So ended up all through school here on the 87 state championship team, senior year.
Wow. What position did you play?
I bounced around, linebacker, D-line.
Wherever they need you.
Yeah, for the most part.
Okay.
And a bunch of the guys are still in town, which is great. That's why I love coming back.
For sure.
Get a chance to catch up with everybody. And then went to college and played football out there at North Dakota State in Fargo. And I met my wife out there. And then I got into coaching, GA'd at North Dakota State. Okay. And then coached college football in Missouri and Colorado for close to 15 years. And then when that dried up, through some connections back from North Dakota State, guys that were landscape architects, had connections with, the original generation of the newfangled turf. And they're always looking for guys, former coaches, former players, so you can talk the talk of the athletic side of things, but then you can be a quick learn on the turf side of things.
Sure.
Not so much business, but just the ins and outs of turf. And so that fit in good. We were able to get back to the upper Midwest for some odd reason. And and now we're back. Actually, we're settled in central Minnesota. We're west of Minneapolis, about 45 miles in St. Cloud. And it just ended up being where Sprinturf was looking for someone in the upper Midwest. My wife was from more the Fargo-Moorhead area. Being from Fond du Lac, we were kind of well in between. And that's where we settled in, because Sprinturf had, for whatever reason, had a nice little footprint in Minnesota, even going back in the early 2000s when things were just starting to get going. They were in a couple of places in St. Paul. They had done a couple of fields at St. John's University in central Minnesota, only about 15 miles from where we're at now, where we live now. And so that's kind of where we landed. And then my area has expanded now, where I've been in Dickinson, North Dakota at Dickinson State University, and we're at Mount Carmel High School in Chicago. So that's my width of my territory.
So you're on the road quite a bit?
Yeah. Like this week I was in Ames, Iowa, Kenosha, and now I'm back here.
Do you like that?
Sometimes.
Yeah. It's a balance, right?
Right. Well, and especially we're getting to the point now where travel is a lot easier.
It is.
Not so much gas prices, but roads. You don't have to worry about snow coming in or anything like that. So the busiest part of the year for us, from my standpoint, is in the fall, where you're getting ready to bid on projects, or you're getting ready to set proposals up for projects. And then the bid season runs, well, basically now it's almost from Thanksgiving through about now. We're kind of wrapping up. We've still got some things out there that we're keeping an eye on, but we're starting to get to the point where we're transitioning to construction.
Sure. So what's the history of turf? Was there kind of an original inventor of artificial turf, and things kind of transition from traditional sod, or what does that look like, and when did it start?
Well, the timeline, you can go way back to the very late 60s. The timeline was, trying to think of the name now. They're still in fertilizer. Escapes me. But it used to be called ChemLawn, I believe, something like that. Chemgrass.
Is that like chemical lawn, or?
Yeah. Well, they were making essentially it was nylon.
Nylon.
And that's the original AstroTurf.
I see.
So going all the way back to that and every
that
college
was like a
had
carpet.
It. Yes.
I mean, that was carpet on top of concrete.
It was very short. Yeah. A little bit of a pad underneath. Rug burns all the time.
Yep.
I played on that as well.
Sure.
And it was brutal. So about the late 90s, a couple of different entities along the line had seen in Europe where they were doing something that's a little more what they call the long hair, the actual grass fibers, and different ideas on what to use for the infill. So you've got traction and you've got the cushioning without the pad, because the pads were becoming really cost inefficient.
Sure.
And unaffordable. And so it got to the point where about probably mid-90s, they came up with a pretty good idea on what they needed, how to put the product together, what infill works the best, the crumb rubber and the mix of the sand, or just the crumb rubber. And then from there, it kind of took off. So you had the big name was Turf, and they're still around as that brand. They're a small little part of the whole Tarkett conglomerate, the flooring company that's all over the world. And a couple other companies had come and gone. There were companies that were making this type of material for other applications, and then they kind of evolved into the idea of extruding the green fiber. But a lot of that extrusion was happening in Europe still, and it still does today. Holland's Tenkati is a big company that does all the extrusion of the polyethylene fibers, all different applications. And then obviously this is one of them. Sprinturf was different, where they had started as a small group that was doing sports surfaces, and got into this in the Philadelphia area, couple of guys, and tried to make their own name. And this was back in 97, 98. So they were getting in on the front end, and it really grew from there. So they were making splashes, like I said, in the Metro Twin Cities area, or the Philadelphia area, the Atlanta area, and even far out west in California. They were all over the place, but they were basically a supply and install company. So they dealt with providing the type of turf to essentially their spec, or whatever the spec was, and then installing it as well. And so I joined in 06 after I got out of coaching, 06 or 07, and kind of jumped in the middle of that first generation. And since then, things have really evolved a little bit in terms of what type of fiber you're using and that kind of stuff. And in 10, right after kind of the economic downturn, in 08 and 09, where things really slowed down, and Sprinturf actually ended up as that supply install company merged, or essentially was absorbed by the main manufacturer that we were dealing with, and they were based out of Atlanta at the time. And so when we merged, it became Integrated Turf Solutions, doing business as Sprinturf. So we're actually kind of like you guys, where we're making our own product here in the U.S. We're distributing it ourselves, and we're installing ourselves too. And that's really been for over a decade
kind
now.
Kind of a one-stop shop.
Right, exactly right. And so, there's always there's two phases to it. There's the turf, but then there's also the excavation and the base construction. So we've partnered with places, and when you get into sports facilities, when there's lighting involved, we've been able to partner up with different groups. So there's always that, okay, what's the next step for Sprinturf? Do we stay where we're at? And we've never done track surfaces. That's always another one, because those always seem to go hand in hand, turf and track. Flooring, other applications. We have a whole other side of the industry from a landscape specialty product side too, called ProGreen. Product comes out of our plants in Dadeville, Alabama, and Chatsworth, Georgia. And again, it's all coming through the same kind of system in terms of the company, but it's much smaller projects, much different type of turf, lawns, dog runs, batting cages, anything that's essentially not an athletic field is the whole ProGreen side of things too. So there's a lot cooking.
Nice. No, that's a great overview. What's the sales pitch for turf? I'm sure I could come up with a few obvious ideas, but when you go into an athletic department or you meet with a landscape architect, what's the sales pitch? What's the cost difference between traditional turf and obviously I don't think it needs to be cut like a traditional lawn. So there's maintenance savings, but what is your pitch for an owner?
A lot of what's nice is a lot of those questions have been answered over the last couple of decades.
True.
So the curiosity factor isn't really there anymore, or the luxury factor, except for some communities, where it's still considered maybe a luxury they don't need. But really it comes down to being able to meet the needs of what they're looking for. The biggest one is accessibility, and being able to get more than just games on the field, and then at that point a limited number of games. So the idea of the synthetic turf now, as we know it, the infill systems, is to be able to provide the kids, whatever level they're at, when they step on the field, it's as close to pristine natural turf as they can get, from a feel, potentially from a look, from a safety standpoint, all those different things, no matter what they've done beforehand. So you could have baseball practice in the morning, a soccer camp in the afternoon, and then there's a JV football game that night. Each time the kid went out there, all those different activities throughout the day, they're stepping onto the best field they could possibly be on. Whether you're not going to get that with natural grass.
There's not a big rut or a divot.
Right, exactly. There isn't a sprinkler head.
Yep.
There isn't the unwavering bit that you see. So it's really accessibility,
consistency throughout the day, throughout practice, games.
Yeah, right. And then when you get into the idea of the maintenance, like you were talking about, where obviously you're not mowing it, you're not fertilizing it, you're not watering it, you're not marking it. That's a lot of time where the field's actually offline, and it becomes you can really use it. Like if you talk about Fruth, but every school, that facility now becomes the centerpiece for activity, whether it's during the weekday for classes or whatever you've got going, physics classes, some kind of experiment, or even at the smaller levels. We did a field for Southwestern High School in Hazel Green, Wisconsin. So the field is literally right next to a dairy farm, and the calf barns are right next to the field. The field's done. It's a beautiful little facility, football, soccer. The first activity that happened on that field when it was opened was elementary school recess, and the kids were out there just going bananas, just running around on it.
Turns it into a multi-dimensional asset as opposed to just being used for the once a week sporting activity.
Right. It doesn't sit dormant for so long.
Yep.
And then it just in general, you can extend your season of use as well. So even you get into Thanksgiving when it is getting cold, or there has been a little bit of snow, you can even push that snow off and still use it. Same thing like now when you've got the freeze thaw, snow coming in tonight, or whatever the case may be, it's still going to be a usable facility.
Have you guys done any heated fields? I know it was a big deal a couple decades back when Lambeau Field got heated turf. Mm-hmm. Have you had to get involved with any projects like that?
I don't know if we've done any specifically, but the companies that still do that, where that basically it's salt water running through tubes underneath that just keep the temperature, on the natural side, obviously for for fermentate. You know the word I'm trying to think of there. So the grass continues to grow and stays green.
Yep.
And then from a turf standpoint, you don't see it as much. They did it where the Gophers play football now.
Okay.
It was TCF Bank Stadium, but they did that when the Vikings moved in a couple of years back, so they could keep the snow off. Basically, it was a help for snow melt.
Yep.
And to keep it a little bit more playable, because the field, in December, the field still freeze.
Yep.
And so they can get pretty hard. So that was another idea, is just to keep it safe as well. So it's not quite as much, because you can just plow the field off if you need to.
I was going to say, you can plow this just like anything else. You have to re-sprinkle in some of the rubber.
Yeah, the rubber pellets get stuck in the snow and get pushed off to the side. So a lot of places like up north, we've done a number of fields from like, say, DC Everest, Merrill, Medford, Tomahawk, some of those areas, Rhinelander. So when they do push snow, they end up with piles of black on the sides. And it, like now when it's starting to melt, it looks kind of shabby, but it's easily brushed back in with their equipment.
Reuse it.
Redistribute it, yeah.
So walk me through the product architecture here. You were nice enough to bring in some samples, but what are the different components of your product?
The main things you've got are the green grass fiber itself, which on the extrusion side, they're still calling it yarn as it comes out of the extrusion machines.
So it comes out as more or less a piece of yarn, and it gets cut and then applied to the backside.
Right, it's on big spools.
I see.
It's on big spools, and all that extrusion happens in Alabama for us, and then all that gets shipped to the tufting and coating plant in Chatsworth, Georgia, where these big, huge looms, multi-needle looms, run the backing is 3 layers of fabric.
Okay.
And so that runs through the loom. The yarn gets tufted in and cut at a certain height. And all that's variable. And then ultimately those big rolls, then once they're tufted, run through a coating machine that put on a secondary backing of urethane coating that seals everything together.
So will you guys have sub-assemblies of different styles of grass, or do you kind of make every field to order based on the size of the extrusion and other dimensions?
It's a little bit of both.
It is, okay.
Whereas the fibers are typically on our end, the yarn is basically either going to be a monofilament fiber or a slip film fiber.
Okay.
Slip film is the original technology where instead of coming out as blades of grass, it came out as a sheet of green, and then it was perforated and cut.
Okay.
And that's how they created the fiber. And that was designed to split apart as the field aged, and it trapped all the infill so you wouldn't see it flying around as much. That's this sample. This was kind of brushed out, but that gives you an idea how the fiber splits apart. And it's still used today. The monofilament's the other side of things, where it's extruded through a spinneret, so it's got shape to it, and it comes out like a spaghetti noodle, basically.
This kind of looks like a rough on a golf course,
right?
Around the green.
Without the infill. That's I think slip film fell out of favor. I think because originally that was all there was used.
Yep.
But and then when monofilament came in, everybody goes, "Oh yeah, the samples. That looks like our grass. That's what we want." And then the industry more or less realized that one or the other doesn't work great by itself. Combining the two is the best way to go. So since 06, 07, at least on our side of things, we were slower to go to monofilament, but we were combining the fibers in every other row as it's tufted in. And that's become almost the go-to across the board in the industry, whether you're playing football or it's a multi-sport or it's baseball. You're dealing with what we call dual fiber. So you got the monofilament and the slip film, get a little bit of both, the good look and the fiber that traps the infill to keep it from flying around.
Nice. So what does maintenance look like if something gets damaged on the field? Is it you replace a patch, or you replace a roll, or what does that look like?
No, usually it's a really small area that ends up being a patch.
Yep.
And usually it's a line. So when the field gets installed, originally we call it the belly of the field. Basically, the big rolls run from football sideline to football sideline, and all you see is green and white football yard lines. That's it. And then on the outside, the rolls go the other way. So they go across, and then on the outside of that sideline, they run along, say, the sidelines or whatever. Then once all that's green, all the other markings, the logos, the hash marks, the football numerals, soccer lines, lacrosse lines, baseball base marks, that kind of stuff, where the softball bases would go. We can put little tick marks in. All that gets inlaid in after it's green.
I see.
And then ultimately the infill goes in last, gets brushed in last. So a lot of times those lines are what potentially come loose, the inlays. And we're talking after, sometimes it's been 4 or 5 years before anything really happens. The one thing we found on soccer fields and lacrosse fields, where the lacrosse goalie is, they're really good at scuffing things up like a hockey goalie does in front of the crease. And so they scuff up too, which means the infill's getting scuffed. And then ultimately that means the fiber and the fabric's getting worn down faster than everywhere else. So those little patches, so sometimes it's a 1 by 2 foot patch, sometimes it's 6 inch by 6 inch, or sometimes it's just re-gluing the line back down.
Well, at least if there is some type of a maintenance event, you don't have to get up on a 60-foot lift. In our world,
Right.
if there's some type of maintenance event, it's not at grade, so it
Right.
gets a little bit more challenging. But
Yeah, it's a lot of hands and knees.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and we get super excited anytime we work on a project with a turf field because it makes the lighting look that much nicer. But
And that's why we like some of the videos you guys have
Yeah.
where the fields just pop out of the gym
Yeah.
when you guys are displaying the lights, but we're looking at the green turf going, man, that looks good.
nice. Well, that's a win-win.
Yeah, right.
So what does walk me through kind of the process of a construction project? Who are the people involved? As a regional sales manager, who do you call on? From what does a project management process look like? How many of your projects start out with a landscape architect? How many of them are discretionary? What does some of that project management process look like?
Sometimes that varies from region to region, but up
Yep.
here in the upper Midwest, almost everything runs through either a landscape architect or a civil engineer.
Yep.
That's kind of morphed into a specialty of athletic field design.
Sure.
The guys at Rettler Corporation do a lot here in Wisconsin. Point
Absolutely.
of Beginning's another one
Yep.
where they do a lot. And then there's some other civil engineering firms, whether it's down in Milwaukee, that do every once in a while will have a project come up. So we really are the main thing. One of the main things I'll do is constantly being in contact with them, not so much on product, although that's always part of the discussion. It's just what's coming up. Who are they working with?
Yep.
Who's ultimately looking at a new project, whether it's a full conversion from
Understanding the pipeline, right?
Yeah. Because they're way, way, way on the front end of a lot of that stuff.
Yep.
They're even dealing with schools when they're doing tennis court resurfacing. They may be dealing with that, or parking lots. Then ultimately the work comes their way for the field or the facility redevelopment. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is we've still got to be really focused on the end user as well, and trying to make sure they're familiar with the fact that it's not. There are other brand names, and certain names mean things in terms of, well, are you talking generically? Like Kleenex thing. Are you talking generically?
Xerox.
Or are you talking? Yeah, right. Well, you guys deal with that a little bit too with certain names. So it's a lot of that. A lot of that is where you're trying to make sure you differentiate it yourself enough, and then also promote the projects that you do as well.
Yeah.
So then, from that standpoint, you're on the sales side quite a bit,
Sure.
and promotion, and then ultimately part of our role as the regional manager would be also, now we're collecting the bid docs and the forms and running through the spec and getting that into our estimation office.
Process moving.
Yep. Pushing all that over to our estimators, and ultimately, if we win the proposal or the bid, then it goes to operations, and then ultimately you finally get to the work standpoint, manufacturing and delivery and installation. But there's a lot of different entities you're trying to touch on. So because my area is so big, sometimes I really want to get a little deeper with certain things, like say the Fondy Soccer Complex. I've got to keep in touch with those guys as much as possible, and yet here I am chasing specs for the project up in Stevens Point or the project in St. Cloud or whatever the case may be. So you're constantly trying to backtrack and make sure you hit all the touches that you need to hit in terms of a sales thing and a familiarity standpoint. And then most of the time in Wisconsin, Minnesota's the same way, Iowa is always like this as well, you got to win the bid. So you got to be on top of where's their budget, what are they looking for? Are we meeting the spec? Does the spec fit us?
Yep.
all that kind of stuff. You've got to negotiate all those things too.
And it's crazy how much happens in the last 1% of the bid process.
Right.
The technicalities of how the documents need to get dropped off and where they get dropped off and all that. But I guess from a sales so it's kind of a quasi sales, project management, marketing. There's a lot of facets to sounds like to what you do. If you had to write a book on sales 101 in a engineered product sales environment, what are some of the highlights that you would touch on? Because I would imagine you rely on teams, you rely on engineers and other people to help support some of the project, and there's probably certain things that you can't always control. But what are some of the highlights in a technical product that are important for salespeople to understand?
Well, and from an end user standpoint, when you're dealing with different types of sports, you want to make sure that the turf system, the whole thing, is matching up with the way you'd want it to perform.
Sure.
Basically, the biggest difference is when you're talking baseball, softball, as opposed to soccer, football, lacrosse.
Okay.
So that's the biggest divide really in the industry. But within that now, you're dealing with some of the big factors that we're always touching on is face weight, which is the amount of grass per square yard.
Yep.
And over time, we've found that, kind of like you guys deal with light poles, the better the gauge, the better that pole's probably going to be. Same thing, better the face weight, the higher the face weight, the better your field's going to be in year 10, 11, 12, when it's been there, what everybody assumes is forever, and it's still performing. It's still holding the infill. It still looks good. The other bit is infill, and how much rubber is used for cushioning and traction, how much sand is used for perceived stability and weight. So there's a big range of where companies like to be at and where it's potentially the safest and all those different things. So you're always trying to hit on a lot of those points. As Sprinturf's always been very good at, because we're our manufacturer, we don't have a cookie cutter type
very
system.
Similar to us. You
right.
can custom tailor it based on the requirements.
Yeah. So if the pile height's only 2 inches, then you need this much infill. Well, if you want this much infill, how much sand do you want? How much face weight do you want? This is going to look better with this face weight, and so you've got to measure all those things out, and that's where the designers, they help, because they're most of them now have done enough projects where they're setting a fairly standardized spec that almost everybody can meet.
And you say designers, the landscape architects,
right. Yeah.
And do you we have an application engineering team at Wisconsin Lighting Lab that does CAD work. They support designers and engineers. We do layouts. We do custom mechanical fabrication. What does it sounds like you're a technical guy, and your sales process is very technical. What does the engineering team at Sprinturf look like, or is a lot of it outsourced to the landscape architects?
Most of it is, and that's really just the way the industry runs.
That makes sense.
Whereas from our side, our technical side is the extrusion.
Yes.
Which is well beyond me. You're talking resins and polymers and things like that. So a lot of that just would fly by everybody for
chemists,
the most part.
Right?
Yeah, right. Exactly right. And so a lot of that gets farmed to the field designers.
Yep.
Where they come up with their spec, something they've used, they like, they're comfortable with. And every once in a while, there's still some architects out there that really get pigeonholed into it's got to be this, which means it's only, one brand of turf, where they don't really make it competitive. So you're always dealing with that a little bit. But on the other side of the sales thing, you've really got to, what we were trying to push is the fact that we are that kind of factory direct.
Yes.
So there's a lot more value in what we're doing from a bid standpoint.
And you can limit the downside of the telephone game, right? They're always one point of contact from the actual manufacturing process.
Yeah, and that's the one thing I think that gets missed a lot on. And even if you're talking other sports surfaces, whether it's tracks or gym floors or whatever, where you're buying a product through a distributor and then they have somebody else come in and install it, so you're never really talking to the same person or the same company that you've had in your head as to, we're getting this.
Yep.
So you lose that connectivity.
And that's, with us, we have multiple channels to market. And for us, regardless of the channel, we always try and get in front of, the engineers, the specifiers. Even if we're supporting a distributor or a sales agency, we always try and push to get in front of the right people, just to limit that telephone game.
Mm-hmm. And then in the long run, because of there is a fairly transient type. The industry, people move around, companies come and go, and I've heard some of the podcasts too, where supply chain's such a huge issue nowadays.
Yeah.
Where we've been able to miss that hurdle quite a bit because we're all in house.
Yep.
And in the U.S., so we're not dealing with shipping. But a lot of product is still, especially yarn, is still coming over from Holland or the Middle East. So there's all kinds of delays and that kind of stuff. And even then, like I've tried to really emphasize to end users, you may be talking to company Z, but yet the product's actually coming from D and E.
Yep.
And even though you've never heard of D and E and you have no idea where they are, that's what you're actually buying. And so that's what we try to really provide the value of you can actually go to the plant. You can see where the product's actually produced. Who's going to be installing it. We do about 90% of our own installations still.
Man,
yeah.
That's awesome. So truly vertically integrated all the way to install.
Exactly.
That's
right.
Unique.
And that gets spun a lot in the industry as to who actually is integrated, who's not, who's vertically integrated. So
do you have to be licensed to do install at that level, or is it
certified?
Certified. Okay.
Yep. So like all our guys run through a training every year.
Yep.
And we've got 50% of our crew foremen have been with us for over a decade. So
that's awesome.
They're really seasoned. I mean, it's not easy work.
Yeah.
But they're out there. They're the rock stars because they really get it done. And everything's so efficient because they're so used to the system. They know how the rolls come off the truck. They know what the next step is all the way along. Is if there's a hiccup with the plans to what's actually happening on the field, they can make the switch fairly easily when those guys are installing. Whereas when you get subcontractor guys, they just want to get done.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah, it's almost you guys are doing your final assembly right in the field. That's like
right,
the plant.
Exactly
the plant builds the sub assemblies, and your install team does the final build. That's pretty cool. So do you have a network of excavating companies or other folks that you can partner with to support the owners and end users?
Yeah, it's up here. It's the Midwest, Minnesota and Wisconsin is a little bit different, where there is almost a divide between, not a divide in a bad way, but you've got your field builders.
Yep.
And they're bidding on certain scopes of work. And then turf is a lot of times a separate scope. So we're able to concentrate a lot heavier on just the system itself and what we're actually proposing and what we're throwing a bid in on.
When you say field builder, is that the GC or the excavator that's shaping the area?
The excavators, and sometimes they're hand in hand.
Yep.
But the excavators and the folks that understand the really tight tolerances you're dealing with when you're excavating down to the subgrade. What does the subgrade have to be at? 95% compaction. Then you bring in the stone, the size of stone, the gradation, and then the second level stone is the leveling lift, where it's a little bit smaller. It's a little bit dustier, a little bit dirtier, but you can actually grade that out to almost pool table smooth. And that's what the turf gets laid on most of the time. The other big step is ultimately getting into underlayment pads, like you were looking at, where there's different types of pads now, where now they've taken that safety to the next level, where, you've got the turf, and it's been around for nearly 3 decades, and it's been tremendous from a safety standpoint, and collisions and falling on the turf and rug burns have disappeared for the most part. But now the pads really have come back into favor because they're so much more affordable and easier to use, easier to install, that the pad really ensures the safety of the field, especially from a shock attenuation standpoint, for well over 2 decades.
I was going to say, what is the design life of the field?
For the turf, we're seeing right now, the original generation of turf fields are probably lasting somewhere between 10 and 12 years. Some fields need to come out at 9. Some are making it to 12 or 13. So you're right in that range. And I think a lot of times now, with what we've dealt with or done with the fibers and the resins, you're going to get beyond that 12 before schools need to start thinking, oh man, we've really got to start looking at this and get a plan together for the replacement. The pads now that a lot of folks are using, those will be there for at least a couple of turf cycles.
I see.
Most of them are gonna carry a warranty of at least 14, if not 24 years. Turf warranty is only 8. So you've got a little bit of discrepancy there, but especially out east, where that's been kind of the norm for a lot longer. We've replaced a number of fields that have the pad there where we're only maybe patching or replacing some pieces of pad or underlayment and then putting the new turf right back on top.
Gotcha. You know, as you kind of alluded to on the lighting side, you know, that market, as far as the mass market, is really dominated by 1 to 2 huge companies. And I'm curious from you know, a product technology standpoint on the turf side, how long did it take the landscape architects and some of the other folks to start to become, you know, more self-sufficient on the design side, and where did it switch from training and education of the market to you know, to where people kind of were you know, yeah, I guess more self-sufficient? How much do you see your competitors you know, creating, you know, confusion at times with you know, with some of the folks involved with the purchasing decisions?
Well, the confusion is probably part of the game.
Yeah.
In some respects, for a lot, you know, with a lot of those companies where they're trying to hold on to market share,
yeah,
because there's, you know, it's not so much that competitors have been added, but the competitors have gotten better.
Sure.
And however you want to look at it, you know,
yeah,
just there's a couple of different ways to put the system together, like we talked about with the face weight and the infill stuff. So that's, people have realized there's not just one mousetrap. There's a couple that work really well.
Exactly.
So that's helped. But I actually coming out of coaching and into this, right as that was probably had already transitioned.
Okay.
Where fields have been around, especially out east, for nearly a decade. The most recent fields, or whatever, the original fields in Wisconsin probably went in like 03, 04, 05. So I was just coming in when those were going into the ground, or had been in the ground already. So there was already a lot of that had taken place. So it was probably before my time in terms of when it became you got a landscape architect, you've got a turf company, and then you've got field builders. I think that had already sifted itself out originally.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, in the lighting side, there was a major technology shift over the last decade from, you know, more traditional lighting sources to LED, and the major player, you know, they were very hesitant to transition to LED. So there were, you know, sports and high mass and infrastructure lighting is really the last market to do a large transition from metal halide to LED, and I think a lot of it was based on, you know, the education in the market, which was coming from, you know, a single source of information. So that's one of the things that, you know, I would say it's getting a little bit easier because, you know, customers do know there are other options out there. You know, whereas traditionally you had one large company preaching one gospel and one preaching another, and, you know, what we try to do is give people options. And you don't want an infinite menu, right, but it's like, hey, if you want remote power, we've got an option for you. If it's a budget job and you want on board, you know, we've got an option for you. Where traditionally, if it was coming through 2 huge, you know, companies, you know, they were gonna, you know, their sales teams and their engineers were gonna push that solution regardless if it was best for the customer or not. So I think, you know, now that the LED technology and the controls technology and solid state lighting has been in the market for a number of years, it seems as though the market has become, you know, more aware of some of the, you know, some of the real information, and was just curious on that comparison. But as you said, that maybe started a few years, you know, before your time.
It's still evolving, because I think it's very interesting how similar some of our experiences have been.
And JJ has mentioned that too, is from a company standpoint, we have similar sizes and similar positions in the market.
Yeah, and it's that same battle that we're always dealing with is, okay, we can actually make and provide whatever the end user wants.
Yep.
But you've got to limit them a little bit, otherwise you're scrambling all the time.
Yeah.
From a manufacturing standpoint. So that's why you really try to hone in, but yet, you know, someone says, well, isn't your baseball system 2 inches on the outfield and an inch and a half on the infield? And we're like, well, yeah, that one is, but this one over here is all 2 inches, or this one's 1 3/4, and, you know, so you've really got to balance out I don't want to confuse them, but I want to make sure they're getting what's probably best for what they need, but also allow them that they have some options too.
Sure.
Along the line. So there is a lot of that balance too that still goes on. I mean, you'll see that even from the architectural side, where spec adjusts a little bit over time in terms of, especially if you're dealing with pads, because that changes what you want to do with the turf to make sure it's not too soft or too cushy. You want to hit that right balance.
Got to be able to run fast too. Yeah. The softer the pad, the slower people are going to run.
Yeah, right. I mean, everybody, you think about
losing energy.
If you run on a wrestling mat for about 2 minutes, it feels great, and then all of a sudden your calves are sore and your knees are achy because it's so squishy, and you're like, oh, this maybe isn't so good. So
have you had players or coaches or scouts, or essentially the turf and the field can change things, player to player, area to area. I don't know if they're measuring the speed of a player or performance, or how much the turf can affect that. But do you get feedback from coaches and from players?
Yeah, some. Where older fields are going to feel hard.
Yep.
Or they're so used to it they don't realize they're on a field that's probably maybe a little too hard. And then they get onto a new field, or they get their field replaced, and now it's new again and fresh, and they're like, oh, man, this is really soft. I don't know if I like this. You get some of that.
Yep.
So much of our market is on the high school side of things, or the small college market, where we're not dealing with, we're not dealing with Camp Randall, or we're not dealing with Ohio University or anything, or State University like that. So some of that really minute perception, we don't deal with a whole lot.
Oh, maybe in Texas they do, right?
Yeah,
right.
every once in a while. Every once in a while, exactly. But you do get some of it. So the fresh field's always going to feel softer, and that's Sprinturf really made a lot of hay and actually probably stayed around in business when they first came out with, where the original idea was you need a lot of sand and some rubber, and sand weights everything down. But
that's what we have here.
But it makes it. Actually, I don't even have any sand in my little sample kit there, but a lot of silica sand, and then some rubber, and overall the sand just makes the field really firm. And Sprinturf went the other way and patented it on an all rubber system. Well, the reason why the sand's there basically is to flatten it down and should be used as its ballast to keep the carpet, the width, the whole breadth of that down and flat, because the product was so light. Well, Sprinturf went the other way and beefed up the fiber face weight, beefed up the backing, added the dimensional stability into the coating, and said, well, we don't need that 8 pounds per square foot. You need 3.5. And so we've done a number of all rubber fields, and that actually was one of the first hooks that Sprinturf had, was
no sand.
No sand.
Nice.
And it, the moisture wicks away faster. Your field might not freeze as fast. Lots of things that people would talk about.
If you can improve a design with fewer components, that's always the dream, right?
And we still do them. I mean, a couple of fields we use it now, maybe a little bit more as a value added option for especially on the high school side. But every once in a while, a college still considers it when they're really looking at being tight on their budget or making sure they get something within a budget. We've still done a number of all rubber fields that perform fantastic. They don't have a pad. That would be too soft, but that works really well. And then obviously the dual fiber system that Sprinturf, basically everyone thought Sprinturf was going to go out of business back in 2007 when we weren't doing 100% monofilament, because that was the rage. Instead of hanging on to old technology, we had a company that thought newer technology was always going to be better. And ultimately that fad came and went a little bit. But the idea of combining the two fibers was really a Sprinturf genesis, and then ended up being, now every field we do in Wisconsin, almost, the spec is probably going to be dual fiber. Every once in a while there's a monofilament in there still from a old spec, or just that's, soccer tends to want a little bit more monofilament because the fibers have shape, so it's got a little more resiliency, so the ball sits up better, rolls more natural. Slip film, it will tend to ultimately curl and lay flat, like Bermuda grass down south, that we never see. But the balls skip, and it doesn't kick as well because it lays down too much. So you got all those
always teed up for them, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So combining the two really has been great when you're talking about, almost everybody needs to use it for more than just one sport. So being able to combine all those perceptions of what a sport needs into the dual fiber system has been a great move for Sprinturf, even though I don't know if technically we planned it that way, but it's worked out.
Awesome. Well, I think Becca said we got about 2 or 3 minutes left. Is there anything else you want to touch on?
Well,
closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts. I think there's a couple of communities in the state of Wisconsin that could really use synthetic turf, and hopefully that's on the way. So we'll see what happens here as planning continues here and maybe a couple other places. I know this one's always been a focus for me, obviously, trying to get some synthetic turf somewhere besides up on the hill.
Well, come back anytime. If you ever have to do a presentation or you want to use the showroom, just
That'd
let
be
us
great.
know. I'm sure they need lights as well.
I'll take you up on that.
Might be a win-win.
That'd be great.
Well, man, you really know your stuff. Sounds like a cool company, and more turf fields the better because it makes the lighting look amazing. So thanks for coming on.
Vice versa. Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it. Thank you.